So glad to talk today to the host of the Within Reason podcast. His YouTube channel has more than 650,000 subscribers. He has spoken to amazing guests on his own show, everybody from Neil deGrasse Tyson to some apologists like William Lane Craig and Frank Turek and others. And he's also engaged with Catholic bishops and people like Ben Shapiro from the Daily Wire. Alex O'Connor, great to have you, brother.
Seth Andrews, I believe this is our first tango. I've met you before, but I think this is the first time we've done the show together, right?
Yeah, what are you doing here? You're slumming. Like, why would you be on this show? I mean, you've sat across from Ben Shapiro. Dun, dun, dun. No, I got to talk about Ben in just a second because he is a thorn in my side. And
is
perhaps
that right?
One of the banes of my every time he speaks or tweets, I literally feel the vein in the middle of my forehead pop out. I'm going to get to him. You and I have some things in common, at least two things. I think we both believe that Jordan Peterson is word salad in human form. And we both, I think, agree on the British monarchy, that it's sort of an expensive accident of birth club. I don't know. I just finished watching all of The Crown on Netflix. An amazing series. It's great drama, masterful storytelling. Didn't change my opinion on the royals. I know it's old hat for people who live in the UK, but you are anti-monarchy? Let's start there.
Yes, and as far as I know, it is still technically illegal in the United Kingdom to call for the abolition of the monarchy. So I come to you now risking life and limb and imprisonment for the rest of my life. Of course, the point that I like to make about this law is that, of course, nobody actually takes it seriously. It's just a strange vestige of our constitution that even the government refuses to take seriously these days. And I suppose this is how I see monarchy itself. It's kind of an echo of something that people used to think was important. I agree with you about The Crown, by the way. It's a wonderful piece of, I would say, I mean, it's strange. I sometimes describe it as a great bit of conservative television. I mean, it's quite clearly an exercise in nostalgia, and that's why I think people got bored of the later seasons. They've performed worse, at least colloquially, from what I've heard. And watching the show myself, I didn't quite make it through the last season, but I think that's because people enjoyed a sort of cinematic look at what life was like in the good old days. And so there's a sense in which it has that conservative vibe. However, I have seen it criticized in right-wing media as having a strong Republican agenda, probably because the show sometimes takes liberty in criticizing the monarchy, at least implicitly. So I enjoyed the show too, but I think part of the reason for that is to help with the continual recognition that people are making in my country that the royal family are just that, a family. They're just Homo sapiens like any of the rest of us, and that defending their institution has become, I would say, almost impossible in the 21st century.
All right, well, let me play devil's advocate.
Please.
They're part of the national identity. I guess it's #tourism. People love the monarchy. Why would you kill their dreams? You know, the fairy tale.
So they do. I mean, the monarchy are quite clearly an emblem of British identity, just like the London Eye or Paddington Bear. For what it's worth, I think that the London Eye should be ripped down too. The thing was supposed to be temporary, and it's this sort of ugly stain on an increasingly ugly city that is London. You know, putting it next door, essentially, to the Palace of Westminster, I think is an aesthetic disgrace, and is the most principal, other than the Barbican, the principal challenge to my view that beauty is in fact subjective. If you ever want to test that intuition, just go and stare at the London Eye for long enough and you'll be shaken to your very core. Paddington Bear as well, the difference is that people, grown adults, don't pretend to take it seriously or believe in its existence anymore. I have no problem with people saying that the monarchy are a sort of representative icon of British society, but the interesting thing is that if I ask you to think of the royals, if I ask you to think of the monarch, chances are you're picturing Queen Elizabeth. Indeed, if I asked you to think of the Queen of England, if I asked you to picture the Queen of England right now, who are you picturing? You're probably picturing Elizabeth. I can't be certain of it, but you're not picturing the Queen of England. The Queen of England is Camilla. Nobody thinks of Camilla. And it seems interesting to me that if it is true that the monarch serves this, emblematic role, that this is a role that can be served at least as well and probably better by a dead woman than by a living one. I think that has a lot to say about the institution itself. You also mentioned tourism. Tourism's brought up a lot. There are a few things to say on this. I mean, everybody likes to talk about tourism as if our decision about who the head of state should be subject to the whims of tourism. I mean, I pointed out before that Chester Zoo in the United Kingdom is a bigger tourist attraction than Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle. And I've commented before that I wouldn't therefore be in favour of having its executives or the animals which are kept within its cages elected as head of state. People like to say that, well, the reason why people come to the country is because the monarchy is still in action. And I'm afraid I just can't believe that this is true. My colleague in this matter, at least, Graham Smith, once sat down with the chair of Visit Britain, who told him that there's absolutely no evidence that the UK would make any less money in tourism if the monarchy were to be abolished. It's not like people are going to stop visiting Buckingham Palace. At the time of the coronation of King Charles, I messaged a friend of mine. I said, hey, what are you doing? I'd love to just go down into London and into where it's all happening and look at the events, just see the spectacle. And he said, oh, I'm sorry, I'm actually on holiday at the moment. I'm in France. I said, what the hell are you doing in France? What could you possibly want to do in France as a tourist now that they've abolished their monarchy? I can't understand why a single person would want to go and visit the beautiful, architecturally impressive city of Paris without it being ruled by an unelected head of state. It just doesn't make any sense. I mean, come on. Can anybody actually take this argument seriously? I don't know. I struggle to see it. Even if they did bring enough money in to make it sort of worth the amount that we're paying them, I still don't think that's a good enough reason to justify them being the head of state in our country. I mean, imagine if somebody tried to say that we should keep our current prime minister because, extra tourists come down because he's quite a character. People want to catch a glimpse of Boris Johnson through the window of 10 Downing Street, so let's keep him as the prime minister. It would be a ludicrous way to try to determine who the head of state is, and I think that should apply to the monarchy too.
I think the divine right of kings or queens is probably at this moment my biggest objection. You're born better. I mean, they would dispute that at its surface, but given how they are perceived and treated, I mean, the idea is that they are divinely ordained, born better than the commoners. Would you agree with that?
I'd say the idea was that. I don't think anybody can actually take it seriously anymore, which is why you don't tend to see this attitude taken even by the royals themselves. I mean, Charles talks about serving his nation rather than ruling it, because of course nobody actually believes this anymore. Even they themselves can't seriously believe that, especially if you take the Church of England is England, but the king is the king of the entire United Kingdom, which includes Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. If I'm expected to believe that the reason why he has the right to rule over these nations is because some god ordained from time immemorial, a god whose true nature was, of course, only fully understood when, coincidentally, Henry VIII got bored of his wife, as kings will sometimes do, that this god ordains through some kind of, specific desire that this man is to rule over Great Britain, as well as a few of its surrounding islands, including the top sort of 15% of one of those islands, and that the history of abdications and wars and invasions and infighting and assassinations don't count towards thinking that maybe there might be a bit more arbitrariness in this process than people like to talk about. No, this is just sort of the method that I suppose God chose to bring his rightful king to the throne. It just doesn't seem serious to me. And the problem is that we're in an international world now. Right? It's quite easy to forget that there are people existing and living outside of your own country when you're living in the Middle Ages. I mean, you never think about other countries, really, if you're just a common subject of the king. But now we're constantly confronted by the fact that there's an entire world out there, and it just seems very strange, I think, to people that God would ordain that this king rules over this particular, allotment of territory. It just seems strange. It just seems absurd. And so I don't think anybody can take it seriously anymore.
Segue to Ben Shapiro, who I mentioned just a few moments ago. He is a right-wing, I would call him a journalist, commentator, activist. He is founder of co-founder, I can't remember, the Daily Wire. He is hugely popular. He is also astoundingly, alarmingly, jaw-droppingly wrong almost every time he says something. He just did a rant about the female feminist documentary filmmaker who is going to helm the next Star Wars.
And they've now decided to turn over the universe to a person named Sharmeen Obaid Chinoy. So who exactly is this person? Well, she's mostly famous for having made a couple of nonfiction documentaries that won Oscars about feminism and anti-feminism in Pakistan, which that's fine. But what does that have to do with Star Wars? What makes you think that you can transition from making a terrific documentary about, say, honor killings in Pakistan to now you're in charge of the Star Wars universe? Like, where is that? How does that happen? Well, she then was a director, one of the directors on Miss Marvel, the 2022 series from Disney Plus that literally no one watched and that no one wanted to watch and that no one cared about because it looked not good. And they've decided to put her in charge of the next Star Wars movie, which will focus in on Rey. You remember Rey, or maybe you don't. She is the star of the last Star Wars trilogy, in which they killed off all the characters you love in favor of characters that no one gave any hoots about whatsoever.
And Ben Shapiro says that producer Kathleen Kennedy is legitimately the worst entertainment executive of his lifetime. We're talking about someone who's produced some of the biggest films of the last half century. He predicted the Barbie movie was going to die of wokeness. It would crash and burn like the Hindenburg. Now we're looking at $1.4 billion global revenues. And he's gotten into morality with you. This was a post from Ben Shapiro. I'll just read it. The Bible is rooted in distinctions, that which is holy and that which is unholy. The entire goal of religion is to separate good from evil. Secularism insists on the exact opposite by dissolving all boundaries and distinctions in a vain and naive hope of a better world. I guess this is a play on the objective moral standard argument. Let's talk about Ben Shapiro's take on morality versus yours.
Well, I must say my experience of Ben Shapiro wasn't particularly bad, at least on that day.
Well, you guys had a very agreeable exchange. I thought there would be more fireworks, but you two were remarkably even voiced, and props to you for that. So.
I don't enjoy battle for battle's sake, really. I don't find it to be productive. I don't find it to even be particularly entertaining, at least not when you're actually in it. It can be fun to watch, of course, but it turns you into something of a drama channel, which I don't think anybody wants. I don't watch much of Ben Shapiro's content, so I don't really know what to say about him more generally, but I will say I didn't know what I was to expect when he walked in the room, knowing he's about to come in and sort of debate me. And I've a lot of people say this kind of thing about Ben, so for all I knew, he was about to walk in and sort of be a bit sort of hostile or a bit on edge or sort of sitting down and right, let's get on with this kind of thing. But no, he walked in, he shook my hand, he was perfectly amicable. We had a chat before everything was rolling. I got on with the guy. It was fine. I had a lot of people messaging me afterwards being like, was he an a-hole, all of this kind of stuff. And I was like, I'm sorry, but he just wasn't. I actually quite enjoyed the conversation. And as you say, I think it was quite sort of civil and even-handed, and there wasn't any real sort of gotchas exactly.
Might be an example of getting adversaries or opponents or even just interlocutors in the same physical space. And perhaps it's a little easier to maintain a level of, an even voice and an even temper. But you were talking about good and what is good and your own struggles with the word good. And I've heard apologists, religious people say, well, if you're not religious, how could you know what was good? But you said you may be uncomfortable with the word. Can you explain?
Well, I don't believe in objective ethics. The view that I'm most closely aligned with is a view called ethical emotivism, which you'll probably have heard of. Perhaps your audience haven't. It's just the idea that ethical statements are essentially expressions of emotion. What this means is that when somebody asks me how I ground good, I can't tell them. The principal objection that I had with Ben Shapiro was that whatever criticism he made of atheism, well, without God you can't have free will. Without God you can't have ethics. I'm happy to just agree with that, to say, sure, you can't. But I don't see why it is that by believing in the existence of God, that changes, if you see what I'm saying. That was the principal criticism. So when I was asked, how do you ground good? I have to just say, look, I can't. Not at least not in a way that's going to be satisfactory to either Ben or the Christians or religious people who are listening. I mean, it's a Christian show, despite neither of us being a Christian. That's probably what I meant by saying I have a problem with the term, but what I really wanted to get into was my critique of the idea that believing in God makes that problem go away.
I think, and don't let me misrepresent you, but I got the vibe that you asserted God belief actually made the problem worse.
I'm sort of conjecturing that it can. I mean, like, where a religious person might want to say, well, if you don't believe in God, is there anything stopping you from murdering somebody? And to be honest with you, I just don't know. I don't know. Seems to be a somewhat empirical question, what actually happens to somebody's brain depending on what they believe. But it's very easy to just say, if God doesn't exist, then everything is permitted. But the most famous inversion of that Dostoevskian phrase is that if God is real, then anything is permitted. So the question I raise in return is to say, well, look, can't you just as easily say that if you believe that God is telling you to murder someone, then there's nothing I can do to talk you out of it? It may even be more difficult to talk you out of it if you believe that God is telling you to do it. There are problems, I think, with trying to ground morality in the existence of a God, especially if it's done so on the grounds that it essentially can't be done anywhere else. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the religions of the world are false. I think that they are incorrect. That is, I don't think there really is a supernatural authority. And what that means is that the inventions of religious morality are just those inventions, and inventions of a human mind. Now, if you have a human morality that recognizes that it is essentially a series of compromises between the history of mankind trying to get along with each other on a planet, then what happens is sometimes these ideas and these philosophies rub up against the real world, and we can adapt them as necessary. Now, there is a deep problem with this, and that is, if I meet a man who wants to kill me, or a friend, and he says that he doesn't believe in God, there's very little I can do to talk him out of that, except I can threaten him with legal sanction, I can threaten him with moral reproach, exclusion from the moral community, but there's not much more I can do. However, if a person says that he wants to kill me, and he believes that he wants to kill me because God has told him to do so, then I don't even have that minimal reproach available to me, because there is no law written by any man of any time that could ever count one iota against the dictates of the creator of the universe. Therefore, if that God in fact does not exist, and if these moralities are in fact human inventions, then what you have in the grounding of an ethical system in the dictates, allegedly, of the creator of the universe is all of the arbitrariness and subjectivity and failure and faults of nihilism and human invented morality, with all of the certainty and all of the faith and all of the unanswerability of the creator of the universe. That to me seems a dangerous cocktail that we drink at our peril.
Speaking here with Alex O'Connor of the Within Reason podcast. I've heard, in fact, I heard Ben Shapiro mention it. Our own Speaker of the House speaks about it. There have been sermons preached nationwide about the United States founded on Judeo-Christian values. And I've been struck by the term. We just throw it out there. Some people say that it marks Judaism sort of segueing into Christianity. Some say that Judaism and Christianity are kind of equal partners, Judeo-Christian. Some people, they reject it because Judaism is sort of Jesus-free. You're right. I mean, how does a Christian embrace Judaism whenever they don't really embrace Christ? I don't know. Help me out. What's your take on Judeo-Christian from your vantage across the ocean?
Well, it is interesting how people have just sort of accepted this term in the lexicon. One of the great interests, if you believe in it, and one of the great criticisms, if you don't, of the Christian story is its seeming contrast and friction with the Old Testament. People talk about them as if they're different characters, the New Testament God and the Old Testament God. That makes sense in a literary sense, but as a theology, this has to be the same God. The interesting thing is that when people say Judeo-Christian values, I don't think they're talking about what's in Scripture. They're not talking about what's in the Bible. I think this has a lot to do with Tom Holland's thesis, his book Dominion, which tries to claim that specifically Christian values have so embedded themselves into Western culture that we consider Christian ideas to just be these self-evident moral truths that the West is based upon, and we don't even recognize that it's Christian. I suppose the problem I have with this is that it may be the case that what people have claimed as self-evident, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, maybe property, these kinds of things. These are not self-evident. They're only self-evident to people who have sort of adopted these views as at a sort of depth of societal construction that they become sort of ethical truisms. The problem is that even if this might be true, and even if this might have come out of nominally Christian societies, it seems to conflict with what's actually written in the scripture. I mean, when you ask someone like Tom Holland, what kind of Western civilization values are you talking about? I mean, what are the archetypal values of Western civilization? I mean, I don't know, things like equality of genders, and you look at what St. Paul has to say about women and a question mark is raised. Maybe it's about the idea that everyone's born free and the idea of human rights, and then you look at what the Old Testament has to say about the ownership of other human beings as private property. And indeed, the New Testament also, at least implicitly, condones slavery as well. That seems to be out of accordance. Western civilization is built upon a capitalist economic system, which seems to be out of accord with the kind of sort of, let's say, moral worldview of Jesus and his asceticism and sort of communal living. In other words, I don't actually think that what people are calling Judeo-Christian values, Judeo-Christian society, is anything to do with Judaism and the Old Testament or Christianity and the New Testament. What they're talking about is just the history of Europe over the past few hundred years or something like that.
What's that line? Let's play a game, open the Old Testament to any verse and do exactly what it says. Last one to go to jail wins. I always thought that was, kind of interesting. I don't mean to belabor Shapiro, but this was part of your discussion. Then I'll move on. You got into Old Testament slavery, and he leaned into this and I've narrated an audiobook by an Assyriologist, Dr. Josh Bowen, did the Old Testament endorse slavery, where he really, really sort of unlayers the onion. But, he seemed to lean into, this was the system in place at the time. Therefore, Yahweh had to condescend and use the system. He didn't want to disrupt the order.
If you believe, as I do, in a God who spoke to human beings in some form or fashion and has to speak to them on a level that they can understand, in ways they can understand, then that immediately is going to discount the ability to do a lot of very radical things that would have appeared radical in 1200 BC, but now appear to be commonplace.
Well, so many things to say. I mean, one is to say, even if it were true that God for some reason couldn't abolish slavery as a practice, he certainly could have put some regulations on it. And this is what a lot of, I don't know what to call them, Christians, Jews, like to say, is that, well, look, at least we can see that God seems to be regulating slavery. So he's trying to sort of ready people for one day abolishing slavery. The problem is that those regulations are still proactively immoral. And it's not like, I mean, I can understand if God says, stop doing this or stop doing this. And he doesn't tell you to stop doing everything because maybe people aren't ready for that yet. Or maybe he doesn't think to mention absolutely everything you shouldn't be doing. But there are times when God gives explicit permission to do particular things. If you sort of take a city, if you siege a city in war, and the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible says that if you find a woman that you find attractive amongst the captives, then you can take her as your wife. You take her home, you shave her head, you cut off her fingernails in this kind of bizarre ritual. And after 30 days, mourning the loss of her husband, who you might have just killed, you take her as your wife. Now, that seems immoral to me. I might be in a minority there. I don't know. The problem is that if you want to say that, well, God just couldn't have abolished slavery altogether, you have to contend with verses like this. What's going on here then? This isn't him sort of, slowly condemning and putting restrictions on things. It's like, no, here's a proactive way that you can take a wife from your captors. It just seems impossible to describe it in the terms that you're talking about, in other words. The other thing to say is that if it were the case that God could only ready people for one day abolishing slavery, wouldn't the New Testament have been the perfect time to do that? That is, if it's true that God couldn't just abolish slavery altogether because people weren't ready for it, why not give them a few thousand years, and then by the time of the New Testament, maybe they'll be ready for an explicit condemnation, but it never comes. No, God leaves it not to the Logos incarnate to tell us that slavery is wrong. He leaves it to some Christian preachers hundreds, over 1,000 years later, to work out by reading between the lines of what Jesus says, despite the fact that Paul says, slaves be obedient to your masters, not just the good ones, but also the cruel, or the froward, as the King James has it. Despite the fact that Jesus sort of casually mentions slavery in a story that he's telling, which seems he could have chosen anything, but he seems like he wouldn't do if he had a problem with it. No, if you see what I'm saying, we're expected to believe that God sort of designed this so that slavery would be abolished by people reading between these lines and getting at what God really wanted all along. Forget the fact that he doesn't mention it in any of the books of the Old Testament, which is a library of books, not a single book, it pays to remember. And then when people say, well, they just weren't ready for it. Well, guess what? We've got a whole New Testament. But I guess they weren't ready for it then either. No, it was only sort of in Christian Europe or something that people were ready for it. It just seems strange to me. In other words, I don't actually understand what people are saying when they say this. What are you saying about your God? What are you saying about your scripture? What are you saying is the point of the New Testament? I don't know. It doesn't make sense.
I don't get the generational context. How is sex slavery on any level acceptable thousands of years ago, but it's not today? I mean, it's sex slavery, right?
It does seem to be sex slavery in a few places. Perhaps the most common example is Numbers 31, where Moses instructs his armies to kill the Midianites, to kill all of the men and the women who haven't slept with a man, but you keep for yourselves the women who haven't slept with a man. Look, it's not sort of explicit. It's not like keep them as your sex slaves, but it's quite clear that they're at least supposed to be taken as wives, as captives of war. And there are other areas too, the one I've already mentioned, for example, that do seem to indicate at least taking wives. And I don't know if that would be sex. When we think of sex slavery, indeed, one of the points that does need to be recognized, and it's something that Christians and Jews will say that I think is true, is that when we say things like slavery, we tend to think of like antebellum United States slavery, that kind of thing. And slavery of the Old Testament wouldn't have looked like that. But the problem is that even when you understand what kind of slavery we are talking about, it still seems morally problematic to us. People like to say, for example, that you have to understand that this is a society where women can't survive on their own. If their husbands have been killed in war, there's no way that they're able to survive on their own. They don't have any property, they don't have any rights to speak of, they need a man to look after them. And that's why the Bible says, well, take these women as your wives. It's essentially a protective measure for them. And that sounds quite convincing. It's like, oh, you know what? Fair enough. If my husband had just been killed in war and I wasn't going to be able to survive, then maybe I'd like to become someone's wife just so that I'm protected. Okay, fine. But then the question becomes, why does this only apply to the virgins? Why is it only the virgins that get that kind of protection? If the woman is married to the man that you've just killed, you just kill her too. It seems to have maybe something to do with sex. That's not to say that they're sort of kept in a basement, tied up in the worst form of sexual slavery that you picture in sort of modern human trafficking conditions or something like that. But it still seems morally problematic, and it's something that, because it's written explicitly and it's explicitly condoned and permitted in Scripture, the option isn't available to essentially reinterpret these texts. It has to have either been morally permissible at the time and not now, which turns God into something of a moral relativist, or God had to have permitted something immoral, which brings a whole bunch of problems of its own.
Well, I'm here speaking with Alex O'Connor on human rights. You did a debate at Oxford with an Islamic apologist, a guy named Sabor Ahmad. The title was, Can Atheism Justify Human Rights?
Now, from an atheistic perspective, all you have is space, time, matter, energy, and chance. Using those building blocks, how can you come up with the idea of right and wrong and impartiality? You can't. But from a theistic worldview, you have the idea of justice as an ontological principle, which is real and true. Alex is saying, but I can't touch it. But again, he's got this limited physical idea of, okay, but if I can't touch it, it's not there, right? But that's a very limited, crude way of actually thinking about reality.
Well, let me play apologist. If Alex O'Connor says, I don't like murder, but you don't have an objective standard, you are an atheist, you're godless. Why don't you like murder?
Well, I don't know, but it doesn't matter, because what we've done is we've sort of psychologized it here. It's exactly the same as if a bit of rain falls on your head and you sort of recoil a little bit and you sort of go, oh, God. And I go, hold on, why didn't you like that? Why did you react in that way? Why did you recoil? You just go, I don't know, I just don't like it. It's just a fact, I just don't like it. I almost didn't choose to recoil in that way. I just did. It was just an expression. It was just a reaction to what I've seen. And that's what the ethical emotivist does. They don't claim that they're saying anything true. They don't claim that they're making a claim about the world. They're just expressing an emotion. And crucially, they think that everybody's doing this when they talk about morality. So ethical emotivism is really a philosophy of language rather than a philosophy of morality.
So you're not making a false equivalent statement. Forgive me the interruption, but you're not making a false equivalence, a value statement that murder or not murdering are the same because someone may have a subjective reaction to it.
The important thing to note is that people talk about morality as if it's either objective or it's subjective. Ethical emotivists say that it's neither. It's not subjectively true. It's not objectively true. It just doesn't have this truth value, right? Saying I like murder or I don't like murder, that has truth value. That can be true. It can be true that I don't like murder. But just going, boo, murder, can't be true or false. And that's the difference between ethical emotivism and like ethical subjectivism. Ethical emotivists say that there just can't be truth value. It's the same. So other forms of non-cognitivism, for example, so emotivism is after emotions, you're expressing an emotion. But some people think, I think R.M. Hare is a proponent of this view, if I'm not mistaken, that ethical statements are more like commands. That when I say murder is wrong, what I really mean is something like don't murder. That's what I'm saying. And the phrase don't murder can't be true. It can't be false. It's just a command. And so if somebody says, well, are you subjectively saying that murder is wrong? Are you like, no, there's no truth to be objective or subjective. It's just a command. It's just an expression. If you see what I'm saying.
Philosophers, you're so complicated, Alex. I'm just saying.
It's a headache.
I saw on your channel near the end of 2023 something I have never seen before. Now, I've seen walkouts in debates, and I wouldn't call your exchange with Peter Hitchens a debate, really. It was just a discussion, a couple of interlocutors in a room. And for those who don't know, Peter Hitchens is brother of the late Christopher Hitchens. And before I talk about Peter, Christopher and Peter actually debated each other like back in 2008. That debate is on YouTube, and it's fascinating. Peter is a Christian, and I would call him a Christian apologist with some very problematic ideas. And they were at the time debating the Iraq War. This is one of the very few things that I sort of disagreed with Hitch on was he was very hawkish about taking out Saddam. And of course, we all saw the debacle of the WMD claims and the vacuum that appeared after Saddam was dispatched. But you have taken issue with some stuff that Christopher Hitchens said. And, that's a pretty gutsy move. He's pretty beloved in the free thought community. What's your problem with Hitch?
Well, I've accused Christopher Hitchens of being a sophist. There are times when you watch Christopher Hitchens speak, including the debate that you mentioned, where some of the greatest speeches that have been given in perhaps the past 100 years. But a lot of the time, they're essentially stand-up comedy routines. And look, there's no problem with this. Debates are essentially just theatre. But if I asked you to take Christopher Hitchens' arguments that he makes and to formally syllogize them, to take them, to put them into your own language and to put them into sort of premise, conclusion form, I think if you publish those arguments as, a compendium, people wouldn't even come close to being convinced by them. I'm not sure that that's the case. There might be a few that people like. But in my view, there were too many occasions where the things he was saying were just sort of void of argumentative force. Now, look, I love Christopher Hitchens. Anybody who is familiar with my work will know how much he was an influence on me. His writing and his speeches have had such a profound influence on everything that I do that it's even seeped its way into the way that I talk. And this sort of happened unintentionally, but people sometimes comment that it's like I'm imitating his cadence, which I think when I'm actually at a podium giving a talk, I can sometimes do. This speech at the Oxford Union that I gave, I saw some comments saying the same thing. In fact, one of my friends who was at the debate told me that when I was speaking, somebody sat behind him. He was sat there with a girl, maybe his girlfriend or something, and he heard this person turn to this girl when I was speaking. And this guy doesn't know who I am. He just saw me at this debate and say something like, he's doing a Christopher Hitchens or something like that. And I thought, okay, fair enough. That can be a compliment or an insult depending on who it's coming from. So throat clearing, love the guy. However, it does seem quite strange to me that there is this attitude of, wow, I can't believe that you criticized Christopher Hitchens. Like you say, he's a beloved figure. What a brave thing for you to do. And I think to myself, how low is the bar for our discussions? I mean, the whole free-thinking atheist skeptic community is supposed to pride itself on the idea that, nothing is beyond criticism and we're trying to get to the truth. But the moment you even think about criticizing somebody from your own side, as it were, you're sort of getting congratulated on how much of an open thinker you are, how much of an open mind that you have. I think, how low is the bar? That simply by saying, this guy that's almost universally revered in this community, some of the things he said, I'm giving 3 examples in this video, I think weren't very good. And people sort of accuse you of an intellectual bravery and uniqueness. I think that's got to be a problem, right?
Well, you mentioned there were 3 things. I mean, give me 1 or 2 examples of disagreements.
There are a number. I mean, so I can't remember exactly which examples I gave in the video, but so for example, I think the first one I gave was talking about the moral argument. And it's also something that you seem to have alluded to yourself earlier, this idea that religious people will claim that you can't know what's right and wrong. I think you said that earlier in this discussion. I don't actually think that's generally true. I don't think religious apologists, at least ones whose arguments I would take seriously, say that. So what would happen is somebody would say to Christopher Hitchens, if you're an atheist, how do you ground morality? How can you say that moral claims are true and false? What are you basing that in? And Hitchens would say, how dare you say that I can't teach my children right and wrong without subscribing to your celestial dictator? How can you possibly say that we can't be moral without God? This kind of thing, which is a subtle but really crucial misunderstanding of the question. This religious apologist isn't claiming that Christopher Hitchens can't know what's right and wrong, that he can't teach his children what's right and wrong, that he doesn't have access to what's right and wrong. He's saying that you can't justify your belief in the rightness and wrongness of those actions, which is true, by the way, because if you asked Christopher Hitchens how he actually grounded them, he'd say, I think we just have a sort of, common humanity. I think we just sort of evolved as a community, and so we need to learn how to get along with each other, this kind of thing. And that doesn't do anything to prove that moral claims are actually true and false. It just means that humans seem to have a generally shared, which also may not be true, generally shared sense that certain things are right and wrong. Cool, but the question is, how do you know that that sense is actually sensitive to the truth? And he couldn't answer it. All he would say is, how dare you say that I can't know right and wrong, which isn't what he was being accused of, but was enough to give him an applause from the audience. I mean, here's one other example for you. If you're familiar with Christopher Hitchens, you'll know that at one point he says, well, if you want to believe in God, then you have to believe that for thousands of years, heaven watches with folded arms.
For 100,000 years, humans are born as a primate species. Expectation of life, 25 years for the first few 100,000 years? First few tens of thousands of years. Infant mortality, rife. Microorganism disease, terrifying. Earthquakes, volcanoes, extraordinary. And fights over land, over territory, over food, over women, over tribalism. Frightening too. For 96,000 years, heaven watches this. With folded arms, with indifference, with coldness. And then around 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, but only in really barbaric, illiterate parts of the Middle East. Not in China or where people can read or think or do science. No. In barbaric, illiterate, backward parts of the Middle East, it's decided we can't let this go on, we better intervene. And what better way than by human sacrifices and plagues and mass murder? And if that doesn't make them behave morally, we just don't know what does.
And he's sort of saying it as a joke, people would laugh because he's parodying it. He's saying, and I know, let's not intervene in China where people can read. No, let's intervene in an illiterate, backward part of the Middle East where, on at least one recording, I have him saying, he says, where they're essentially living like animals. Let's do it there. Okay. Fine, rhetorical point. Yeah, interesting. Why would you do it to these people? But 5 minutes ago, when I was asking you about morality, you were saying, well, we don't need God to be moral. We don't need God to know what's right and wrong. We don't need divine intervention to understand ethics. But now the criticism you're making is that this intervention happened in a weird time in human history where people were living in backwards conditions, living like animals, where they were essentially illiterate and ignorant and living in credulity. Well, hold on, which is it? These two don't seem to gel very well together. Either we need religious guidance and divine intervention to know what's right and wrong, or we don't. And if we do, then your first point doesn't seem to work about, knowing morals without God. But if we don't, then that second point you make about the weirdness of him intervening at a time where people are illiterate and credulous and ignorant and living like animals doesn't work. So you kind of can't have both at once.
At long last, allow me to draw the conversation back to Peter Hitchens. You're sitting in the room. You end up agreeing on two topics. I believe it was legalization of drugs and God. And you got about 40 minutes in. You were still speaking about the legalization of drugs. I thought you were hugely reasonable. You were just asking questions. You were citing some information, statistics from various nations. You were challenging, but not in a rude way. And he gets up and calls you a lot of pejoratives and says you're acting in bad faith and you are a propagandist and you were luring him there under false pretenses, and he just leaves. And did he go, what was the aftermath? Did he go on social media and set fire to you, or what happened?
Well, he did. He did go on social media. I mean, look, I try to make sense of this, and I try to do it fairly because, of course, being in the seat when that happens, it's easy enough to just sort of be stunned and say to everybody, "Oh, look what this crazy guy just did." But you've got to think about it for a moment. You've got to think, well, this must have happened for a reason. Let's try and work it out.
If I may, very quickly though, I need to do my due diligence. The reason that he left, before we talk about how you were treated afterwards, but what were the precursors that caused him to stand up?
Well, this is what I was sort of trying to work out. What he says is that it's because he became convinced that I had lured him into a conversation under the false pretense of wanting to interview him, and instead I'm a propagandist for drug decriminalization, like that's my thing, and I wanted to lure him into a conversation thinking it's about a bunch of different topics, but really it was just to sort of catch him out on this, and that was my goal. Yeah, you don't need to encourage drug use here to decriminalize it. In fact, most decriminalization campaigns go hand in hand with something like a re-education campaign.
I think I've had this actually. I think if this is going to be about drug decriminalization, I'm bored. If you want drug decriminalization, good luck. I'll enjoy the society you get as a result. But frankly, I'm sick of the subject, and I'm also sick to death of the people who promote it.
So be it. Will you be all right?
You're entitled to use that, by the way. Feel free to do so if you want to. But I think you've had me here on false pretenses. What? And if you run this interview, I shall say you had me here on false.
I'm sorry. Which false pretenses?
Well, that this is going to be an interview about several subjects. It's nothing but drugs.
Yeah, I mean,
nothing. You're obsessed with drugs.
This is the first topic of many.
You're obsessed with drugs.
I had planned to.
I've written about it. You've not read what I've written about it.
I have.
You obviously haven't read my book.
I have read your book.
You're obviously reading it with the lights off. You're not aware of anything that I've said.
I have a number.
You haven't read what I've written about Portugal, which is easily found.
I've read that too.
Well, again, you show no signs of having done so. You haven't put to me any of the things that I've said in what I've written about Portugal. It's now, I've been here for an hour and we've discussed nothing but drugs.
Well, I had planned to move on to other subjects. I'm sorry.
I don't think you're entitled to run this. If you do run it, I shall say I don't think that you've got me here in false pretenses.
I was just interested in your views.
I frankly think it's extremely bad manners.
Of course, Peter Hitchens doesn't really he doesn't know who I am, right? He's not come across my work before or anything, so he's got no way of knowing this. But I think my audience will know that can't be true. I mean, the idea that I wouldn't want to talk to him about other topics, religion, for example. I mean, look, anybody who knows me, anybody who knows the sort of Alex O'Connor within reason cosmic skeptic thing knows that obviously I want to talk to him about God and religion. That's like my thing. Of course I wanted to talk to him about that. But he's not going to know that, right? So I'd emailed him, as I email all of my guests, with an invitation to the podcast. I just say my name, I say that I host a podcast, I say how many subscribers it's got, I say who the previous guests are, and then sometimes I say I want to talk to you about this particular topic, because sometimes, you know, that's relevant. And in the email, which I have here in my inbox, I can make sure I'm getting this right. Yeah, I said to him, you know, dear Mr. Hitchens, I told him about the channel, and then I said, I'm writing to invite you to appear as a guest on the podcast. This is an email that he shared on Twitter, by the way, to discuss your work and areas of interest, in particular, issues pertaining to drug decriminalization, whether we're experiencing a moral decline in society and the influence of secularism on that question, and the state of monarchy in the United Kingdom. So there I've sort of given 3 vague subject areas. When he arrived at the shoot, I guess I'd call it, I said to him, okay, Mr. Hitchens, there are 3 things that I wanted to talk to you about. They're drug decriminalization, God and religion, and the monarchy. Now, he said at that moment, the monarchy's a bit boring. And I said, okay, fine, we won't talk about that. I agree, actually. Okay, we'll cut that. Leaving 2 subjects. By the way, he didn't take that opportunity to tell me that he didn't like talking about drugs. Even though later when he was shouting at me, I said, well, how long would have been too long to talk about this? And he said, well, frankly, 1 minute is too long. I'm sick of talking about this. He didn't take the opportunity to tell me that before the interview when he told me that he didn't want to talk about the monarchy. Okay, fine. So as far as I'm concerned, we've got 2 topics, drug decriminalization and God. Now, before the interview had started, I was questioning to myself, what shall I open with? Shall I open with the God stuff? Shall I open with the drug stuff? And I thought, well, because I talk about God all the time, it would be great to open with something a bit different. So that's why I decided to choose the drug thing. That's what it was. As far as I'm concerned, we've got 2 subjects now, drug decriminalization and God and the religion. Now, I didn't expect to spend that long on drug decriminalization. I'm not sure. I didn't know how long. I never predict these things. But my podcasts, he asked how long they go. I said they go for about an hour. But if the conversation's particularly lively, sometimes it's an hour and a half, even 2 hours. Sometimes they're 3 hours long. He said, well, 3 hours is a bit long, but we'll see how it goes. Fine. So I'm thinking maybe an hour, hour and a half. Now, I have seen people claim in the comments, to be fair to Hitchens, the interview was a bit boring. It did go round in circles. Yeah, I agree with that. It was a pretty boring conversation, but I don't think that was my fault. I think that Peter Hitchens had in the conversation a sort of I know this one attitude, that when I asked a question, he wouldn't let me get to the end of the question. He'd interrupt with his answer, and his answer would be the stock answer, as if, oh, I know this question. I've had this question 100 times. Let me answer it. I felt like he wasn't listening to me. You know, I'd ask him about all kinds of things, and he would just give me the stock answer. And when I try to sort of say, well, no, hold on, I didn't say I don't think you've understood my question, but I tried to phrase it in a way that made him realize that I'm asking something else. And he would just sort of say, well, do I waste my time? You know, are you not listening to my answers? The reason that I was asking about this was to get to the question of whether we are in favor of the criminalization of something because of a moralistic objection to it. That is, can't there be things that are immoral?
Look, I don't care what,
but not illegal.
I'm telling you what I think.
Yeah, and
I have moral objections to it, but I don't care if you don't have moral objections to it, because I can also provide you with perfectly good utilitarian, non-moral objections to it.
I think
becoming mentally ill is a bad thing. Taking a risk which appears to have that likelihood is therefore a bad thing. It doesn't take much argument to get through that. You don't need to have puritanical personal morals to think that.
I don't.
If you want to discuss the basis of my morality, we've got time.
I don't think
we do. I don't
here.
think most people will be interested. I have moral objections to it. Like most moral objections, I find they have good practical reasons beneath them.
Maybe my question isn't clear here. The question is granting that it's an immoral practice, granting that it's an immoral thing to take
no, I don't want
in.
you to grant that, because you obviously don't think so.
And so I understand that it was a bit sort of circular, and it did stay on the same subject for a while, but it's because I felt like he wasn't listening to me. He said that if we decriminalize cannabis, we'd have to issue drug tests every single time pilots went to fly a plane. That every single time somebody goes to fly a plane, we'd have to test them for cannabis. And I'm thinking, well, hold on. We don't do that for drinking. I mean, it's alcohol is legal, but we don't test pilots every single time they get on a flight. We sort of have random alcohol testing, and that's enough to deter them from trying to fly a plane while they're drunk. Now, wouldn't the same be enough to deter people from doing it while they're smoking cannabis? To which Peter Hitchens thinks that all I'm saying is something like, what about alcohol? which is what people do all the time on the question of cannabis. It's a quite boring point. People just go, oh, what about alcohol? What about tobacco? I get it. That's a boring thing to say, but that's not what I was doing there. So when he accuses me of just sort of going, well, what about alcohol? I have to be like, no, hold on. That's not actually what I was doing. I'm asking you a specific question about random drug testing. I'm responding to something you've just said about the necessity of testing people every single time. Is that actually true? We don't do it with alcohol. And to be honest, I can't even remember if he, I don't know. I don't know if he answered that or not, but it just seemed like he wasn't listening to what I was asking him. And so, yes, it goes around in circles, but I think that's why. And then eventually, about 40 minutes in, he says, you know what? I'm sick to death of this. I'm sick to death of the people who try to, the people who promote it. At one point, he implicitly called me a moron. That was later on. He told me that he doesn't like me, that he actively dislikes me, that he never wants to see or hear from me again. He told me that I'm a propagandist for drug decriminalization. He told me that I lured him on false pretenses. And I said, look, if I put this out, I don't think people are going to agree with you here. And he said, yeah, I'm sure all your druggy friends are going to love it. At which point I sort of laughed to myself and thought that there's nothing else I can really say.
He even waffled on the release. At first he said, go ahead, release it into the wild. And then he was like, you shouldn't release this. And then he would say, fine, go ahead and release it, but you shouldn't. I couldn't tell exactly. It just sounded like just untethered emotion.
Well,
I suppose there's nothing more I can say here. Run it if I like.
Right, sure, right, if you like. I can't stop you.
I think people would be interested to see your views.
Morally, I don't think you're entitled to run a word.
I think people would be interested to hear your views.
You're not entitled to run a word of it. You just aren't. And I think it's a very good example of my powerful self-restraint that I haven't actually sworn at you. Anyway, if you've got any sense or manners, don't run that.
Ms. Hitchens, I want to run this just...
You're not entitled to run it. You have no moral entitlement to run it. You brought me here on false pretenses and you behave very badly.
Obviously, I didn't intend for this to happen. I mean, like sure, it's dramatic and it gets a lot of views and this kind of stuff. Sure, it's good for the channel. It gets lots of views, but I couldn't believe it. When it looked like he was about to get up, I remember thinking, like, go on then. Like, you're seriously going to do this right now? Like, go ahead. This is going to get way more views than it would have done otherwise. And I don't think I've done anything wrong here. So sure, go ahead. Don't let me stop you.
No, I thought the temperature of it was, you were the adult in the room for sure. Can I speak to
he
drugs?
Accused me.
Oh, forgive me. Go ahead.
No, he accused me of sort of all kinds of things on Twitter. And it's a little bit, I want to say it's a little bit, I think there was some confusion, like you say. I mean, he was saying, I don't think you should post this. And to be clear, if I have a guest on my podcast, generally speaking, if they don't want me to post something, I won't post it. They've given me their time. They could say, look, I was having a bad hair day and I'd rather you didn't post that. It'd be disappointing, but fine. Yeah, you've done me a favor, so sure. But he sort of had this moralistic objection. And then he would say, look, I can't stop you from posting it. You have every right to post it. I just don't think that you should. And it was sort of the moralistic objection that made me think, okay, maybe I should post this. And then he started saying, well, if you do post it, I'm going to start tweeting about it. And I think I was basically saying, look, I have to post this, which is why he then goes, well, I'm going to start tweeting about it then, which is something that I'm not sure I understood at the time. Because I said in my intro, like, well, he's been tweeting about it, so this is my right of reply. But I think he might have only started tweeting because he thought that I was going to post it, if you know what I mean. But there was a new tweet coming out once every 2 to 4 minutes for like 2 days straight from Peter Hitchens about this interview. He said, I was one point he says I'm like guru-like in the way that he's sort of storming out. It's like he wanted the fight because he kept going, I'm going now, and he'd sort of go to the door and he'd be like, I'm going. He had this attitude of sort of like hanging by the door, sort of rocking back and forth, as if he wanted something out of me.
Well, I don't want to see that.
Okay,
I'm astonished at your behaviour. I'm genuinely astonished.
And I'm thinking, like, you're either leaving or you're not. Like, if you want to go, the door's there. You know your way out. Like, off you pop. But he spent 17 minutes, 17 of them, stood at that door, telling me how much he personally dislikes me. So, I don't know. I thought, let me just post it and see what the world has to say about it.
As we get close to the end here, we're talking about the legalization of drugs. It's funny, when I was a devout Christian, and I was for many decades, I knew it was wrong. Drugs are, alcohol, okay, we knew it was immoral, but it's legal, it is what it is. But drugs, marijuana, etc., everything was a gateway. And of course, I'm not remotely a libertarian. I would call myself a proud liberal, but I do have very libertarian views on drugs. Where do you draw? Do you have a line? Legalization of drugs? Does it go beyond cannabis for you? What do you think?
I mean, look, the thing about drugs is I don't really know what I think. I made a video once about cannabis decriminalization because the then Home Secretary of my country was considering upgrading cannabis to being a Class A substance. I don't know if you have the same sort of class system in the United States, but we classify our drugs differently, and the punishments are more or less severe. And so I made a video about cannabis specifically, and actually in that video I sort of took it as a given that drugs like cocaine and MDMA were more harmful. I didn't think about that carefully enough because, of course, as far as I understand, MDMA is not dangerous at all. The thing that's dangerous about MDMA really is that when you buy it from the street, it might not just be MDMA. I know that I want to speak to Professor David Nutt, who was a former advisor to the government on drugs, and he's a drug expert. He's written a number of books about how bad drinking is and about how a lot of drugs aren't as bad as people think they are. And I think he got fired from the government or from being a government advisor after saying something like taking MDMA is safer than riding a horse or something like that. So maybe that was a mistake, but obviously some drugs are more harmful than others, and obviously some drugs are completely different kinds of experiences to others. Like the idea that commonly people say, well, caffeine is a drug, and they're trying to make a point, but it's true. And if you consider the effects of something like caffeine and the effects of something like cocaine, these seem to be much more similar to each other than, say, cocaine and like LSD. The idea that people sort of put cocaine and LSD in this category, illegal drugs, and have caffeine, alcohol, and then maybe also things like cannabis in a different category of like, they're not so bad. It just seems really strange to me because there's such different kinds of things, different kinds of experiences, you know what I mean? And so broadly speaking, I would say that it seems to me that I'm broadly in favor of people's autonomy, right? And there's a complication about some drugs maybe affecting other people, but the same can be said of alcohol. I think I have to say that intuitively, if alcohol is legal, I can't see why other drugs shouldn't be legal too. But the main thing to say is that I'm not sold on this question. I don't know. That's why I thought it might be interesting to talk to someone like Peter Hitchens and see if he could give me an opinion. But unfortunately, that didn't go very well. So maybe David Nutt will do so in future. But I really don't know. But the position as it stands intuitively is that at least if alcohol is going to be legal, then yes, other drugs probably should be too.
All right. Alex O'Connor, how do people find your work?
Within Reason is the name of the podcast. You type in my name, Alex O'Connor, on most platforms and it should come up. I'm still at Cosmic Skeptic on most platforms.
It's been an hour and I haven't walked out, so it must be refreshing for you, Alex. I appreciate taking a chance to talk to me from all the way over at the UK, and we'll watch the channel and the debates and discussions to come, and all my best.
Good stuff. Thanks for having me.